First, thank you all for coming. It's a delight to see so many old friends. Many of you have put up with me banging on about Pushkin for years. I will at least be able to present you afterwards by way of limited reward with your own copy of this result. I want to thank Sarah Ansari, Gordon Johnson, Alison Ota, Bruce Melville, and other RAS colleagues, without whom Pushkin would never have made it to Stevenson Way tonight. Aptly enough, Stevenson's rocket was beckoning its first passengers in 1829. Special thanks to Professor Andrew Kahn, Professor of Russian Literature at Oxford, and to Professor Angela Brintlinger at Ohio State University, who hope to be with us online. I'm grateful to Josh Davis, already Il Emilio Fabro, the finer practitioner whose birthday falls today, for helping me keep it relatively simple. Thank you, Tony, for joining us. You bring real breadth of experience to the subject. We first knew one another in the run-up to the 1991 Gulf War. That proceeded with a surer touch than Iraq in 2003. Washington's ill-fated Iraq blueprint could have done with a helping hand from the likes of Indian Foreign Secretary Henry Dobbs. Percy Cox, whose long career up the Persian Gulf, from Muscat to Baghdad, still commands its fan club, had hit problems and withdrew, this time into retirement. Dobbs, who took over, knew exactly what he was doing and completed the formation of modern Iraq. Ataturk, master of Gallipoli and invading Greeks, eventually agreed Iraq's contested northern frontier, and having seen Dobbs in action, insisted on meeting him one-to-one in Ankara. Such people once frequented this society and the Oriental or East India clubs, alongside more shadowy figures like John Buchan's fictional Sir Walter Bullivant in Greenmantle, who inspired another journey to Arzrum. I'm delighted that Victor Wilkes, Dobbs's grandson, whose wife Anne is writing it all up, is with us here tonight. Pushkin, shown on the screen, is the most accomplished writer I know in any language. That's why he has fascinated me over the years. Russians are lucky to have him. His work is so bound up in language that it transports only with difficulty. This complexity and Constance Garnett's pioneering promotion of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky probably explain why they became the Anglophone world's favorite Russian authors, while in Russia, Pushkin's preeminence speaks for itself. Gradually, that renown has spread. Vladimir Nabokov's 1960s Yevgeny Onegin commentary helped improve understanding outside Russia, while Charles Johnston's and Stanley Mitchell's translations do convey a sense of the Onegin verve. Raisa Gorbachev, troubled that the English did not get Pushkin, encouraged an English collected works, which was brought out by Ian Sprout and is maintained by Roger Clark. I hope that this English edition of the journey will add to appreciation of what Pushkin was up to and the scintillating power of his work. My first clue to the journey holding more than meets the eye was its tortured preface, introducing a travelogue which positively races away on a guided tour of choice Caucasus sites and battlefields, culminating in the capture of Arzrum. Pushkin and the army friends he visited had supported radical political reform, drawing inspiration from the American and French revolutions. Their cause was lost in the failed 1825 Decembrist revolt, It turned out that Pushkin had blotted his copybook with Tsar Nicholas I by going to the Caucasus. It was actually one worse than that. He had been directed there by his secret police minders. When the Tsar found out and was furious, they promptly ducked out from under and left him carrying the can. Pushkin was determined to get his army friend's story on record within the inevitable constraints of appearing innocuous and unchallenging to government. Tsar's anger postponed the day. Opportunity opened 5 years later. French vice consul went into print, rubbishing the 1829 campaign. The journey could now be positioned as paving the way for Russia's rebuttal. But the words required came hard. That's why the preface reads awkwardly, like a reluctant pupil's prize essay. Russia's spectacular 1828-1829 victories over Persia and Ottoman Turkey were a one-off, a byproduct of the revolt. Regime loyalists and Decembrists, some of them exiles of the Caucasus, combined patriotically to fight. Creative tension between their warring styles, regimentation versus swashbuckling, brought out the best in both. The campaigns demonstrated that a Russia of all the talents did perform exceptionally when there was a framework for resolving difference and arriving at consensus. Ironically, this was the Decembrists' political model for Russia. The army's noisy functioning Parlement des Officiers was short-lived. Even before they reached Arzrum, Decembrists were being sidelined. Tsar Nicholas's absolutist New Russia and its yes-men would only once achieve comparably. In desperation during the Crimean War, he turned to Muravyov, era of 1828 and 9. Muravyov recaptured Kars and equipped Russia with its bargaining chip at the peace negotiations. The journey's last two chapters, describing the campaign's victorious conclusion, are distinctly downbeat in tone. This reflects the darkening mood in camp as Pushkin's Decembrist friends were edged out. The journey's undercover content is of two kinds: submerged running commentary and political messages. Running commentary was highlighted and explained in the 1930s by Yuri Tinyanov, who was closely involved in preparing the journey text, the 16-volume Russian collected works. His insight also drew on his much-admired novel, Death of a Wazir Mukhtar, Minister Plenipotentiary, about A.S. Griboyedov, Russia's ambassador who was murdered at Tehran in 1829. Pushkin's political messages are hidden in plain view, but they need a little help. Let me briefly walk you through three of them. At Gumri in Armenia, Pushkin emerges into the dawn air to see a vision, Ararat. The mountain sometimes visible there is not the local mountain, but his secret police minder had given it star billing as the Caucasus attraction, the cradle of mankind. Ararat now obliges with an 80-mile journey to greet Pushkin. So what does he see? He sees Noah's Ark with its raven and its dove. The raven stands for execution. That is the 5 Decembrist ringleaders who were hanged. Here, as sketched by Pushkin himself. The dove stands for reconciliation. And the message is, we now need a united Russia, not a one-party setup. When Pushkin meets his army friends, he marks the moment with a quote from Horace. The first two lines, the ones actually quoted, are innocuous enough. Sentimental reflection on the passage of time. But Pushkin knew his Horace well, his best-known tribute being his own version, in the footsteps of the great Russian poet Derzhavin, of Horace's Ex Ege Monumentum. I've raised a monument more lasting than bronze. The ode he chooses here culminates in worthier airs, opening up and relishing jealously guarded vintage wine. The message is, we have had our day. It's now for younger people to complete the work and secure that brighter future. The third is, as he impishly flags, truly recondite, Uchin Zamuslavada. At Osman Pasha's house, an inscription, allegedly from the Quran, announces, it befits you to bind and loose. The reader is left supposing this is some Kama Sutra-like precept, couple and uncouple, from Ibn Sina Avicenna, or the Perfumed Garden. Far from Quranic, however, the language is New Testament. The words, Matthew 16:19 and 18:18, refer to the church's power to bind and loose, that's to say, to remit sin. Nicholas's regime's strapline was orthodoxy, autocracy, and narodnost, which boils down to Russianness. The message is, it befits a true Orthodox sovereign who loves his people to issue a general pardon. The high point of the journey comes just after Pushkin's reunion with his army friends, as they wait restively in camp for the decisive battles. At dinner, they wash down Oriental shashlik with English beer and champagne chilled in Taurus snows, and enjoy banter in the cavalry commander Raevsky's tent. Yazidis, who maintain religion with Zoroastrian features, have in recent years been horrifically persecuted by Iraqi Sunnis. In 1829, Yazidis from the Ararat area fought alongside the Russians. Their commander serves Pushkin as a screen for what probably went on. The Yazidis' alleged devil worship resembles the now proscribed Decembrist canon. Pushkin accepts the commander's assurances that they do not really worship the devil, adding, I was very glad for the Yazidis that they do not worship Satan, and their errors already struck me in a much more pardonable light. This is jocular comparison with enforced Decembrist disavowal of belief. Pushkin searched out more material on the Yazidis, which is reproduced in the supplement. He may have contemplated pursuing further, but did not. Finally, two episodes may help sharpen up what Pushkin was trying to get across. Both are about spirited bravura, which became the Decembrists' hallmark. The day after he arrived in camp, Pushkin seized an opportunity to do what he had been raring to. That's to charge at Turks and test out his fate in the heat of battle. There's an illustration, his own, of him doing just that. This was one better than Byron and Missolonghi, and quite simply his own irrepressible self. He was rescued from harm by his hosts, told off by the commander-in-chief, and probably teased by his friends for aping the games of glory of the captive in the Caucasus, his own early poetic success. The incident is immortalized in Pushkin's own poem, the Delibash. I'll just take you through it. Skirmishing beyond the hills. Both our camps observed the clash. Down towards the Cossack spills a whirling scarlet Delibash. Delibash, don't brave the lava. Give your life a second chance. Our men said quick for gay bravura. You'll end up on a lance. Cossack, do not rear for war. A Delibash will forward dart, from sturdy neck with scimitar your hero's head to part. In tumult, both collide alike. See the scene, the final score. Delibash impaled on pike, and Cossack head no more. Poetic sensibility transcends time. Marina Tsvetaeva, the much-loved 20th century poet, tells how as a child she caught the sense of the poem, despite no one being able to explain Delibash, and someone even suggesting it meant a Circassian banner. It means madcap, a Turkish irregular. The paragon of limit pushing is A.S. Griboyedov. He was a tough negotiator with long experience in Persia. He already pulled off one coup, repatriation of deserters serving in Persia's Russian battalion. In 1828, he drove a blisteringly hard bargain for ending the war, large transfer of South Caucasus territory and a war indemnity of some 2.4 million, roughly 160 million in today's money. The indemnity in particular rankled with Fath Ali Shah, who was opulent in style, but parsimonious. A series of incidents during Griboyedov's visit to Tehran to present his credentials ended in his murder and the massacre of his legation. Russia, now at war with Turkey, chose not to contest the Persian government's cover story. Britain wanted to keep the Qajar dynasty on the throne and supported the Persian line. Griboyedov, indeed, had even managed to persuade the British envoy MacDonald to contribute to the war indemnity. A British PR initiative now succeeded not only in placing a reinforced Persian version of events before the world, but has thoroughly confused later research. The British mission's George Willock compiled a detailed account published in Blackwood's magazine. Its style and content give it away for what it is, a picaresque improvisation along the lines of James Morier's Haji Baba, which is itself an Oriental variant on Smollett. It masquerades improbably, but wholly in the spirit of the genre's stock in trade, as a Farsi journal maintained by a Persian official living in the Russian mission. Willock was a colorful character, sufficiently pleased with himself to tease his readers with charade clues that give his game away. He looks to have used the aliases George Fowler, who became a prolific travel writer, and Persian Judge Underuz, George the Spy. The evidence surrounding the massacre is re-examined in the supplement. For Pushkin, Griboyedov's achievement and thoroughgoing style embodied the very best of what Decembrism brought to the Caucasus. Bravado he had merely clowned with his own charge at Turks. He awards him prime position in the journey and commemorates him with a fine encomium. In January 2020, Ruza kindly arranged an invitation to the 225th Griboyedov Jubilee Conference at Khmelnytsia, where I presented my work to a Russian academic audience familiar with the subject. Their helpful comments assisted me in finalizing this edition. I conclude with two thoughts. First, Pushkin's messages still resonate for Russia, where the struggle for a more open and inclusive system has continued far longer than Decembrists could possibly have imagined. Second, they're relevant for us too. The open society, its friends and institutions, face challenges not for the first time from impassioned lobby groups who brook no debate and from interests who want solutions enforced with or without consent. The journey offers a timeless reminder that civilized values, which Pushkin himself always finally advocated, really do matter. Thank you.
Well, very grateful to be here at the Royal Asiatic Society. And I want to, first of all, to start off with my congratulations to Derek on his fascinating piece of work on Pushkin's visit to Arzrum, which is something which I had been unaware of before and have learned a lot from in all sorts of ways. And this is the only time that Pushkin, of course, left the Russian Empire. He didn't really intend to go to Asia. His initial hope was to go to Paris, of course, and then we might come back to this tension between the Asian and the European dimensions of Pushkin and more broadly Russia. But I think it's a terrific piece of work, and I commend it to everyone here and listening perhaps beyond. I also congratulate Derek on another point, because I, like most educated Englishmen, know something about Pushkin. As a Russianist myself, I've read some Pushkin, and it is deeply true that you cannot read most of Pushkin in any language other than Russian. And that is part of his greatness, but also part of his obscurity anywhere outside Russian in some ways. Anyway, I'm very grateful to Derek for bringing Pushkin back into my life. And the third thing that I'm grateful for is to the Royal Asiatic Society, pushed by Derek and by Gordon Johnson, to hold this session at a time when there's quite a lot of effort going on to cut back on cultural links with Russia, for understandable reasons, given the Ukrainian war. But I feel really quite strongly that, yes, the war needs to be prosecuted to what is the only ideal outcome, which is Russian defeat. And the Russians have behaved appallingly, both in entering it and conducting it. But sooner or later, we're going to have to find a way back into more sensible relations with Russia. And come that time, a continuation of cultural, social, other links will become a very important platform for rebuilding the sorts of relations which I hope we will come back to. The reason that we're holding this, I think, in the Royal Asiatic Society, and the reason why I've become fascinated by Derek's work and by the whole paper, as I've just said, is that I think that as I've got to know Russia and worked on Russia, we in Europe, we in the West, tend to rather forget that Russia is a country with two ends. It has a European end, which is where an awful lot of the Russian people, Russian economy, Russian culture has been focused, but it also has a vast Asiatic end with all of its own links, which we tend to pay, in my view, insufficient attention to as we think about our relations with Russia, as we think about Russia's place in history. And I'd like to go into this in a little bit more detail. The first point that I'd like to make about Russia and Russia's relationship with Europe and so on is that while we tend to presume that Russia is a European country, actually, of course, there are deep, deep differences between what we might describe as the culture of the eastern end of the continent, in particular Russia, and the culture of the western end of the continent, where I am standing now. And we at the western, I mean, and you know, the history of this, of course, is very evident. Russia, there was the Tartar yoke. Russia was cut off from lots of European developments for a period of about 300 years. Russia is an Orthodox state. Its central religion is Orthodox Christianity, and it sees that, has seen that, and it has been very much part of a crucial, crucial difference between the emergence of Russian culture and the evolution of Western European culture. There are also quite profound differences of that sort, and those differences have been quite acutely felt in several ways on both sides. The Russians in particular, for quite a long part of their history, regarded themselves as being sort of eschatological leaders of mankind. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Moscow was the remaining leader, if I can put it that way, of the Orthodox religion. Therefore, they saw themselves as being the people principally responsible for mankind's salvation. And a great quotation, which I can never resist giving on occasions like this, from a man called Philotheus Pskov in about 1520, as Russia Muscovy was pulling itself together, who said, "The Tsar is on earth, the sole emperor of the Christians. As the leader of the Apostolic Church, which stands no longer in Rome or Constantinople, but in the blessed city of Moscow, Cheerline shines in the whole world brighter than the sun. Two Romes have fallen, i.e. Constantinople and Rome itself. The third stands, and a fourth there shall not be." And that wonderful statement of Moscow as the third Rome, as the place where mankind's salvation comes together, accounts for a lot of Russian messianism and the feeling that they're a centre of history right up, conceivably, until today. So that's one key difference. Another is that we Europeans, we Western Europeans, have regarded Russia as an outsider, more or less, throughout our history. When a man called Fletcher, who was actually our first ambassador, so my first predecessor as ambassador in Moscow, way back in the 17th century, reporting back to his boss, Queen Elizabeth I, he described, speaking of Russia, he wrote a book about it, Russia, the true and strange face of a tyrannical state without true knowledge of God, without written law, without common justice. And that European total otherness, this is somewhere deeply distant and savage, rings on down the reactions of European intellectuals to Russia going forward. Thus, Frederick the Great referred to Russia as half barbaric and barely European. Churchill, of course, a riddle wrapped inside a mystery, inside an enigma, but one rather splendid quotation discovered by one of my predecessors, an ambassador in Moscow, Roderick Braithwaite, comes from the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1782, where the definition of Russia, the description of Russia is very large, governed by a complete despotism and inhabited by vicious and drunken savages. So the perception of the European perception of Russia was always pretty dark and pretty hostile. Meanwhile, looking at the relationship from the Russian end, what the key memories have been at about 100-year intervals of an existential invasion by some European state intended to destroy Russia. Thus, the Poles came along in 1612 and introduced the so-called Time of Troubles. Swedes turn up in 1709, find themselves confronting Peter the Great, but Charles XII of Sweden was intent on breaking Russia up. Napoleon, of course, in 1812, and the final and the most brutal genocidal launching of a war that has taken place in all of human history was Hitler in 1941, with the results that we've seen, that Russia won that war, and won that war for us as well, I think it's worth admitting. And there is really very widespread, up until this day, Russian mystification, going back to Pushkin, actually, who expresses the same question about the Napoleonic invasion. Why on earth aren't the Western Europeans more grateful to us for saving them from massive, brutal tyranny? So misunderstanding and doubts from both sides in the West-Russian relationship. Meanwhile, Russia, as I said, has this big Asian half, more than half, but with much fewer, sort of 20% of Russia's population, I think, and 20% of Russia's economy is over there, but has this big Asian dimension, came into existence as the Cossacks expanded across Siberia in a remarkably short time, in 60 years, between 1580 and 1640, in search, as it were, of so-called soft gold, furs, that occupy this vast area, 3,500 miles from Moscow to the far end, the Bering Strait. And their early encounters with Asian states, of which the core one for my purposes is obviously China. And this fascinating encounter between two very, very different civilizations. The leader of the Russian expedition, as he discovers that there is another state out there, writes a letter to the Emperor of China saying, I'm here on behalf of my emperor, you now need to submit all of your lands to him. And the Chinese response to that is to pretend to misunderstand the letter. Their observation at the time is the Russians must be treated considerately since they do not have the benefits of Chinese education and culture. Nevertheless, the two empires, as they are, need to find a way of living together. The Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1829, sorry, I don't mean 1829, I mean 1689, negotiated in Latin because neither side spoke the other's language, and nevertheless set the border up until the late 19th century and set the basis for trade relations and some very limited communication between Russia and China, and cleared the way for Russia, therefore, to spread its influence through Central Asia, to pick up what is now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. And all of this happens as a sort of backstory to what's going on in Europe, where Russian attention is focused and where European attention on Russia is focused. And the existence of the Asian half only really becomes sort of existential, interesting, when in the late 19th century, suddenly Russia is at odds with virtually all of Europe at the time. They've just lost the Crimean War. They feel they're being rebuffed. There is a big intellectual movement in Russia at the time, the so-called Slavophile movement, which is to, we don't care about Europe. We've spent our time learning from Europe, following Peter the Great's instructions, taking their technology, taking their culture, all of that. That's all over. We are now authentically Russian, and this is the way we're going to conduct ourselves henceforth, led very much in particular by Dostoevsky, whom I will return to in a minute, whose view was Russian culture is going to take over the whole world. We're leaving Europe behind. Conflict, however, between that Slavophile movement and the much more traditional, in a way, the so-called Westernizers, whose view of the world is the West is still the place where, in the technological lead, is the place with the economy, we learn on the economic and other means. Therefore, it is from the West that we must continue to learn. And a leading member of the Westernizers unit to keep things balanced is, of course, Turgenev, the famous novelist, huge contrast to Dostoevsky. There's Dostoevsky, these great 800-page tomes. Turgenev, small 300-page novels written in precisely European forms and structures and so on. Dostoevsky, as far as I can make out, had no truck with structure at all. Anyway, they had a famous confrontation in Baden-Baden in 1867, where they flew at each other and where Turgenev famously observed, if Russia were to disappear, there would be no loss or concern to the world. It's the West who should dominate our culture going forward. Anyway, so all of this row takes place. And this is after, of course, Pushkin has died. But this leads, therefore, actually, given Russia is at such a discount in Europe at the time, to a turning of Russian political attention and ambition in an Asian direction. The Tsar Nicholas II talks about absorbing Manchuria and taking Tibet under his orb. They build, in particular, the Trans-Siberian Railway, 1891, the world's biggest industrial project up until that point, 5,000 miles long, intended precisely to provide a backbone, a link between the old Russian Empire in the West and the new Russian Empire, as they saw it, in the East. It all collapsed, of course, it all failed. They lost a war to another fast-rising, but this time Asian power, Japan. They then fell into the First World War, the 1917 revolution, all of that, and Russia became very focused at that point, taken over. Its latest burst of messianism was Bolshevik communism. We're going to save mankind, but no longer as a third Rome, but through spreading communism worldwide. So a very, very, goodness sake, a creed invented by a German economist. The European centrality of focus in Russian view of the world resumes. Subsequently, as I've said, all of that, but it's beginning to come back, the Asian interest and concern. And for rather obvious reasons. I mean, as we emerge from the end of communism in particular, we emerge into a world where suddenly the world's economic dynamism is in the East, not in the West. Fast-growing countries are China, obviously, India, increasingly. That part of the world is where the economic gains are to be found. Russia itself, okay, it's gone through the communist phase, is trying to rebuild relations with Europe, but is also trying to build new relationships elsewhere. China, again, is central because, of course, China itself became communist in 1949, and that it became so with Russian Bolshevik support. And they then had a rather complicated relationship over the next 30 years, 40 years, up until the fall of communism, certainly in Russia, and then in effect in China as well. They nearly came to war at some point in 1962 because they still had at that time conflicted borders. There were tensions. On the other hand, there was a lot of shared ideology and so on. But with the collapse of communism and with the evident failures of Russia's attempt to rebuild a civilized relationship with the West, started off very hopefully. I was around at the time. When I went as ambassador to Russia in 2004, my instructions were, we've got a great relationship. Okay, Putin, there are doubts about his democratic credentials, but basically we need to build on this and help Russia to become a normal, civilized part of the way the world works. And that visibly has not been an entirely successful approach to handling Russia or how we need to meet the what has become increasingly seen as the Russian problem. And as we Europeans and the West more generally, the United States, became more and more disillusioned with the direction Russia was taking, and at some point proclaimed Russia an international pariah, it became very clear that Russia is not an international pariah. It's a pariah with us in the West, without doubt, and for good reasons. But places like India, China, and many other Asian countries, not only Asian countries, African countries, Latin American countries, their view is the European war. Why should we have any more complaints about Russia illegally invading Ukraine than about the United States illegally invading Iraq? It's seen in an awful lot of the world, including an awful lot of Asia, as not their war, to put it that way. So suddenly the Russians, as they look around for somewhere, well, they need places they can do business with. They need places they can sell their oil to. They need places they can buy manufactured goods from. So their attention has turned back to Asia in general and to China in particular. And this is what you might like to think of after the first failed Asian moment in Russian history back in the late 19th century. We're looking, I suspect, at a second Asian moment with really quite interesting questions about how far that is going to go. And I'm, as I say, pleased to be here in the Royal Asiatic Society, looking forward to much more engagement with organizations like this, precisely because Asia, I suspect, has become a much bigger part of the way Russia is in the world. A man called Vladislav Surkov, who was Putin's chief domestic politics advisor for a while, the man who invented all of the fake democratic processes which are at the bottom of the Putin system in Russia at the moment. A man whom I got to know quite well when I was ambassador there. I used to take senior officials to him, and I remember taking one of these senior officials out and that person saying to me, "That is the scariest man I've ever met." Anyway, Surkov, very sharp, very bright. As we got into the present crisis with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, wrote a paper called "The Loneliness of the Half-Breed," a Dinachество Polukrovki. And what he said, and this has a certain redolence, he said that up until about now, since about 1700, so we're talking in 300 years, Russia has been pulling west. There have been odd divagations. There was the Dostoevsky moment, the Slavophile moment, all of that. But fundamentally, our history, our center of gravity, what we have focused on has been the West. That moment, says Surkov, is over. Russia is now going to be much more oriented towards its Asian end and to its Asian links and to the Asian economic links and all of that. And that will be interesting to see, once we get through this horrible crisis, to what extent Surkov is right, and if, of course, it has quite serious implications in a world where visibly what we're heading towards, I won't call it a second Cold War, because that phrase contains all sorts of emotional baggage, which I prefer to avoid, but I will say we are entering a moment of really quite intense confrontation between the West, United States in particular, on the one hand, and China, on the other hand, is really rather important where Russia falls in the scale. But let me conclude by coming back to Pushkin. And just some thoughts, really, inspired by Derek's work on how Pushkin emerges in all of this, and what this tells us about Pushkin, a little bit what this tells us about Russia. Pushkin, if he had been around at the time of the Slavophile Westernizer controversy, would undoubtedly have been a Westernizer. Pushkin was a deeply Western figure in many ways. If you look at the languages he knew, the literatures he read, the models he took for the things that he wrote, he did write some vaguely Oriental things on the fringes, but the core languages, models, all of that are Western. He once said, and this is a great quotation that I picked up from Derek's paper, on the Orient in general, somewhat towards the end, when he does actually make it to Arzrum, and he says, "There's no more as nonsensical expression than Oriental luxury, where Oriental poverty or Oriental squalor would fit much better. In Arzrum, no money can buy what you will find at a fancy goods shop in any district town of Pskov. He'd been there, he'd seen the exoticism, but he'd also seen the poverty and indeed the squalor that lay behind it. So he had no time for fake Asianism, if I can put it that way. On the other hand, if we come back to the Slavophile westernizer contention, Turgenev versus Dostoevsky, it's interesting that at the moment when Pushkin really began to take off as the core Russian poet, which was the raising of a statue to him in Moscow in 1880, both Dostoevsky and Turgenev made speeches about what a great poet and Russian literary figure Pushkin was. Now, they're very different speeches, they're very interesting speeches. Dostoevsky, characteristically mad and exaggerated, described Pushkin as the most characteristic emanation of the Russian soul, and went on about how Pushkin spoke for all of Russia and all that stuff. Turgenev, much more contained, but captured a key attraction of Pushkin from the westernizing end, which is that he took the Russian language and made it fantastically flexible and workable for the use of not only Western style, but also Skazki, traditional Russian folkloric style lyrics. So Pushkin, in a way, is where the Slavophile tendency of thought and the Westernizer tendency of thought come together. And I think that's been a very large part of Pushkin's continuing, I choose this word advisedly, dominance in Russian culture, as seen at least by Russians. I'm not going to tell a story, but you may choose to, when you come to cutting the recording, you may choose to omit it. One of my more memorable moments as ambassador in Russia, I was flying into St. Petersburg for a meeting late night. June the 6th was the day I remember vividly, which of course is Pushkin's birthday. And it was so, and also the White Nights. So I landed in St. Petersburg about 10 o'clock at night, still bright daylight, of course, out there, went to my hotel and dropped my bags, decided I wanted to go for a little walk before going to bed. So I went for a little walk down to Palace Square, which is the very big square in front of the Winter Palace, and saw a bunch of Russians standing in a little circle, shouting things at each other. I didn't quite know what. So I got a bit closer, and what it turned out these Russians were doing, these were just people off the street who'd gathered in a random way. What they were doing were giving their favorite bits of Pushkin to each other. They were shouting them to each other because it was Pushkin's birthday. That's what you do. You go out and you find a bunch of, not friends, but other people who care about Pushkin and engage in just sharing quotations. And I thought to myself, we don't do that in England with Shakespeare. The French don't do that in France with Molière. The Italians don't do that with Dante. This Pushkin thing is somehow much, much more central to the way the Russians view their culture than any other European state, as far as I can make out, manages with their particular literary gods. So just to make the point of how big in Russian eyes Pushkin is. So secondly, as I've said, Pushkin, somewhere where the Slavophile westernizing division meets. But the third point I want to make about Pushkin speaks directly to the agony, I know, of a lot of Russians living there now, confronted with the situation they're faced with, of they're patriots, they believe in their country, they want their country not to fail, but to hold together in the crisis that it's going through at the moment. And therefore, they are willy-nilly backing, supporting the Putin regime, keeping the wheels in the state turning. Your ordinary bureaucrat, your ordinary central banker, whoever finds him, herself, precisely that situation. Look at Pushkin. As Derek abundantly describes in his paper, Pushkin, as a young radical, publishes a lot of poetry, which actually gets himself into serious trouble with the authorities at the time. Wheeled in, I have to say, Tsar Nicholas I handling Pushkin is an absolute masterpiece of what you do with an extraordinarily difficult, hyped up literary figure. Wheels him in, flatters him, says he forgives him for the free poetry that he's had, and he, Pushkin, will now be an employee of the state working for Nicholas I. And Pushkin, in effect, accepts that. Pushkin's early radicalism, in any case, never really went very far. He never, for example, called for the overthrowing of the Tsardom. He called for rule of law and all those good things. He called for the end of serfdom, but he remained reasonably loyal to the Tsardom as it was. as it emerges in his later poetry, he is also really very committed to the Russian state, to the Russian Tsardom. One of the figures who emerges again and again in his poetry as absolutely central to stability in Russia is Peter I, Peter the Great. And my feeling about Pushkin is that he is caught in exactly the same position as so many Russians are today, that he's loyal to his state, even not much liking many of its manifestations. There's a great quotation from him, if I've got it here, which I should have. No, okay, I haven't got the precise quotation, but in effect, he said, when questioned about his attitude to the Russian state, he said, of course, I detest the Russian state from top to bottom, but I get really very angry when foreigners say that. The loyalty transcends his disapproval of the way the Russian state works. So, and one of the reasons, therefore, I'm Pushkin's great poet, if you happen to read Russian, but he embodies in so many ways the contradictions, the tensions, the tragedies of today's Russia. And I close this with, again, immense thanks and commendation to Derek, but also that feeling that we should continue to read Russia, to read Pushkin, if we want to understand Russia today. Thank you very much.
Nomadic peoples and nomadic economies, and that the ecological background to this is these are very difficult areas to control. One sees it in many ways in northern India. One sees it in little patches in parts of Europe as well. That what you're looking at here is a variation on, you know, the city against the countryside, or the herdsman against the agricultural, against the agriculturalist. And so, in a way, the Pushkin is right when he sees that it's going to be very difficult to push into Asia, particularly into the vast areas of Central Asia, and get any benefit from it. I mean, why? You know, I mean, why bother? And is what's at the crux of the problem the way in which the states in at the western end, if you like, of the Eurasian landmass are themselves in a much more volatile and competitive way and competing with each other. And so it's very much more difficult for them to find areas of collaboration and community, even though that is where they should be focusing their interest. Derek, do you think that?
I think that's very good cut across the issues. All these things are playing across one another in what Tony was talking about, and in what I attempted to tease out of Pushkin's Arzrum. It is the interface between the nomad world and the settled world, which itself in the modern era is changing into an urbanizing society and affecting how its settler society earns its living and where it lives and the style in which it lives. The bit that impresses me for the purposes of understanding this piece of work in its setting in the 1820s is the thrust that that generation thought was the future towards a liberal democracy of some kind and a constitution in place of the extremely well-established central leadership of the Tsar figure. And that's playing through in all this. Pushkin captures a number of contradictions and ambivalences, which we can no doubt come to.
Yeah, the Russian Empire and how it emerged. Russia was behaving in this context exactly like every other serious European state. We went off and conquered India and all of that. The French went off and conquered North Africa and all of that. Even the Dutch retained Indonesia, took and then retained Indonesia. And the impulses, I think, were very similar in all those cases. We're bringing civilization, we've got the technology, which means we can impose our will. The view was it ought to be economically beneficial, or on the whole it wasn't. But also as part of international figura. If you're going to be a big country in a world where the big countries are all empires, then you need an empire as well. The key difference in the case of Russia, people said this, is that while other countries had empires, Russia was an empire. This was a land mass rather than you had to sail off to your colonies. And the linkage, therefore, in a way was much more intimate, and the presumption that the old imperial possessions weren't imperial possessions. They were fundamentally integral to what Russia was. It explains an awful lot about the pain of the breakup, as we've seen it subsequently, and informs a lot of psychology. I mean, Russia, as described, having a second Asian moment, is a moment in a sense of nostalgia for empire, or where the empire was. Now we're well past that nostalgia. Then their empire fell a lot. Their empire only fell when the USSR fell.
But I mean, isn't this ideology of empire and the need for empire? Isn't this it comes after the creation of some sort of connections, networks, and structures, rather than the motivation for them? And how would you distinguish what you've just said about Russia being an empire from, say, the Habsburgs or the Ottomans, or the Persians, or the Mughals?
I don't know about the Persians or Mughals. The Ottomans is a good case, and Turkey, in a sense, suffers from the same post-imperial delusions, although less able to implement them, than Russia does. So, okay, you might include Turkey on the, being an empire rather than having an empire side of the column. Turkey, as it currently is, didn't exist until the Ottoman Empire had fallen.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real distinction there. But to come back to Pushkin, this was all, I mean, Russia had acquired all of this, but it was all a long way away. But it's quite striking that Pushkin was a supporter. At the end of his Ballad of the Caucasus, the poems he wrote, he said, "Wait for it, Caucasus, we're coming for you."
Your Moloch.
Yes, your Moloch is coming. In one of the most aggressive pieces of imperialist poetry that you can actually find at the time. Even the intellectual classes, even if you like to believe he was a liberal, the liberal intellectual classes, like Pushkin, were firmly behind the concept of empire.
Like Kipling.
Like Kipling, exactly.
That's a strand, but Pushkin himself plays the opposite chorus just as much. There's a rounded quality to, if you take his various different quotations together, which I think is partly why his Decembrist friends never took him into their confidence and made him part of their conspiracy, because they couldn't be confident he'd be one of their own tunnel vision types. But he is very sensitive to the other perspective in the Caucasus. It keeps coming out in what he wrote. He's also very sensitive to things about Orientalism in a way, more so than a lot of modern writing on the subject. Because although, as you rightly quoted, Tony does talk about Oriental squalor, At the same time, he's in the same passage, he's talking about impoverished knights in their castles in Western Europe, encountering luxury and wealth for the first time in the Crusades, and in effect being exposed to a superior civilization of the day with all that it had to offer.
So does he have a sympathy for any means of access to the high literature and high culture, painting, porcelain, fabric, and so on, that is associated with the image of somehow Asia being an advanced and wealthy place?
To some extent, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he wrote poems. The fountain of Bakhchisarai is a profoundly Orientalist poem, if I can put it that way. And he wrote imitations of Hafiz, and actually imitations from the Quran. So he picks up stuff.
He does, yes.
From there. But I would argue, I don't know if Derek agrees, that is slightly peripheral to the main thrust of what he spent his life writing and trying to communicate, which is Western European essentially, but with a strong Russian, not Asian, Russian dimension to it in the folk tales and in that sort of stuff.
Part of the Russian culture is us versus them, which is very much founded in the experience in the open plains of horsemen suddenly appearing and the need to identify quickly which side they're on.
Yeah.
Indeed, an awful lot of what we've been talking about is to do with a sort of gradual reverse takeover of Genghis Khan's empire and the successor entities that the Russians found themselves struggling with. So what we were saying earlier about there being a sort of naturalness to Russian expansion actually answers in a way to that, seeing it that way. And if you come at these things as they do collectively, if you talk like us, you're one of us. It is very natural to sort of hunker down as a club. Define who is on the outside and who's on the inside. And that's the reflex reaction you picked up, I think, Tony, in Pushkin responding to outside critics, saying, well, that's what drives us to see it collectively and rather defensively from our group point of view.
And interesting, I mean, this sort of, there's a Russian cultural national inferiority complex. There's a feeling, and there are lots of people who express it. Tadeyev, who's a buddy of Pushkin. Turgenev, the one whom I quoted. Somehow we haven't produced what we ought to produce, given how big and dynamic we are, which I think is part of the explanation to Pushkin's overwhelming presence in Russian cultural view of itself. And he answered for that. Look, we've got this man who's done this fantastic work. We're as good as you are. So Pushkin is both inside and a symbol of this faint feeling of inferiority complex, as I say, in the way Russian culture has viewed the world.
One thing that's certainly there is this special bleeding dimension, which isn't confined to Russia, goes back a long way in history. And has had a very significant run in the breakup of the maritime empires that we were also talking about. You owe us one because you oppressed us and this kind of thing. Pushkin himself is quite good on on these sorts of aspects, at least as experienced in his day. He tends to be quite level-headed and see fairly accurately where all parties are coming from. In a way, we've got, I think, a little bit seduced beyond that kind of objectivity for the moment in seeing some of the special pleading that is being generally directed. But I think we're also all passing through it to a world in which the former territories of empire are standing so much on their feet. As you were bringing out, Tony, in your talk, India now has a bigger GDP than the United Kingdom.
I think
and is very much a centre of new prosperity, and one can see that only building.
I think it's an important distinction to be made here. Pushkin, Pushkin's a decent guy, cared about people, cared about the main values, had the right friends in liberal circles and all of that. But my reading of him going forward is that his loyalty to Tsar Nicholas I wasn't just fake. He genuinely attached importance to Russia holding together, to the empire being a success, providing order, to keeping the so-called narod, the people, down. He wrote some quite startling things about how awful democracy would be in Russia. He wrote about, he read a translation of Tocqueville describing democracy in America. And he said it made him run hot and cold with fear at the implications that democracy might have for Russia. And this is a distinction between Pushkin anyway, and I think more broadly, the Russian intellectual elite and the Western intellectual elite. The Western intellectual elite are much more aggressively individualistic in their view of the world. Remember, Ian Forster had a choice between betraying my friend and betraying my country. I hope I would be brave enough to betray my country. That is the precise reverse of what most Russian intellectuals would say. Perhaps less so now, but nevertheless, there's a quite deep distinction between that statement by Forster, quite widely shared at the time, and Pushkin's view of how you split your loyalties between individual rights and your country.
But I think to counter that, it exaggerates the success of individualism and liberalism and representative democracy that we feel at the moment is embattled, and so we have to come to its aid. But one of the best volumes in the newest version of the Oxford History of England is the one on the early 19th century by Boyd Hilton, and of course the subtext there is that the English are a nasty, brutish and Philistine people, and everyone is really working to hold them down. The progress to what we like to think of as the post-Second World War years of glory is scarred on the way by class and gender and political background, and it takes 200 years to get to where we are. And so I think if you were to look at some of I don't think it's expressed in English culture in quite the way that Pushkin is doing it so brilliantly from what you're both saying about him. But the authoritarian streak and the hierarchical streak in English society, to take an extreme version from the Western European, is really very, very strong and survives, to this day, in a way. But I think that given that we are here in, a London learned society that's purpose is to show an understanding of the variety and richness and values of people living on the Eurasian landmass towards the eastern end of it. I think that what we should take away from this is, why on earth has Derek's translation of a Russian poet appeared in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society? And it is, of course, because it provides a way in to different and interesting ways of thinking about these nomadic communities in Central Asia, about, did we all come from Genghis Khan's vicious settlement and the raids into the more settled agricultural areas, and how should we start to think about people whose religious experiences and appears superficially to be different from ours, or whose musical experience or whose literary experience is different. But the more we probe into it, we find that actually there's an underlying thread of commonality in how human beings behave, how they structure themselves politically, how they organize themselves economically, but there's an infinite variation in the detail. And it's just so good to have, as it were, someone whose perspective is basically from the north of the Eurasian landmass and the experience of settlement and state building and cultural activity from there, rather than from the perspective of perhaps of the maritime nations who are influenced by other things, or by people in the Mediterranean, particularly at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, for whom this easy concourse between cultures is the norm, and is sort of very common. But as a tell, how about James Joyce and Ulysses talking about Pushkin, people out in the streets fighting Pushkin at each other?
I missed it. I didn't know there were references to Ulysses. I have
No. The Irish going around Dublin.
James, yes, no, you're right. You're right. That is a very fair comparison. Right, thank you for that. Yes.